Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our ritual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel, and in Yirtzeh Hashem today we will be learning Daf Kuf Chaf Dalid Amid Beis. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos. We pick up today on the very top line of the Shulchan Aruch on Kuf Chaf Dalid Amid Beis, Siman Shin Tes Vav Sif Yud. We are continuing to learn the halachas of an Oyel Arai. Our learning should be a schus for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael. Bechal Makayim Shehem. Our learning should be a schus for Chayla Yisrael. Rabban Hashem should bring refuas to all those who are in need. Says the Mechaber. Very interesting halachas that we have here today. The first sif that we're going to have, Sif Yud, is written very cryptically, and from the words of the Mechaber himself, it's a little difficult to understand precisely what it is that the Mechaber is speaking about. Of course, if you know the background and you learned the sugya in Shabbos and Daf Kuf Lamed Ches Amid Aleph, it would be much simpler, especially if you learned it together with the Rishonim. The Mishnah Berurah will learn the sugya according to Shitas Harif, and he's going to explain the case the way the Rif does. So says the Mechaber, Talis Kefula. So when we refer here to a talis, we're not talking about the talis that you wear in shul. We're talking about a beged. Talis over here is just a word meaning some kind of a beged. Says the Mechaber, talis kefula. You have a folded beged. Shahayu aleha chutin, and the beged has strings or threads attached to its edges. Shahaisa taluya behem me erev Shabbos. This talis was hanging already from erev Shabbos, and it has these threads attached. Mutar lin taisa, you're allowed to spread out the talis, umutar lefarka, and you're allowed to take down this talis, v'chein haparoiches. And the same halacha applies to a paroiches. Now, the paroiches over here also does not mean a paroiches. It doesn't mean the paroiches in shul. It means any type of a curtain that is being hung in a doorway. So like I said, the words of the Mechaber themselves, very cryptic. We don't know exactly what it's speaking of. We're going to read the Mishnah Berurah, and I have some visual support. I have a construct over here, and I'll show you exactly what it is that the Mechaber is speaking about. Let's see the words of the Mishnah Berurah. Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Lamed Zayin. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Talis Kfula. We're talking about a folded beged, okay? Shenoisna al hamoit, that was placed over a pole. Hanosun bein shnei kesalim. The pole is placed between two opposing walls. Ushnei roshe hakefel, and the two sides of the folded beged, mishul shalin, are hanging over the pole, umagian la'aretz, and they reach down to the ground. V'nichnas bein shnei kitzoiseha, now somebody wants to go under this hanging beged, between the two ends of the beged, the yoshein, and he's going to take a nap. And why is he going inside this canopy? Mipnei hachama. He's going into this canopy because he wants to get protection from the sun. Okay, so we've seen the words of the Mishnah Berurah. Now let me show you what this means. Thank you so much to the inventors of Lego. I've used Lego and I've used magnetiles quite a bit over the years. You'll see Yirtzeh Hashem, Bezos Hashem Yisparach. We should get to Chelik Dalid, where we're going to learn Hilchos Erevin, and you'll see that I make copious use of magnetiles. Okay, so here we have two opposing walls. Here we have a pole. We're going to take a pole, and we're going to place it from end to end between the two opposing walls. Now we're going to take a beged. We're going to take a talis, okay? This is going to be our talis. And we're going to drape it over the pole so that the pole creates a canopy that is now extended over a lower area. That piece of Lego, that green piece of Lego on the bottom, you could even imagine as a bed. So now we've created a canopy over the pole, and it's sheltering this area underneath where this fellow wants to take a nap. Now, the Mechaber added another piece to the puzzle, right? The Mechaber said, Shahayu aleha chutin. There were strings or threads that were attached to this beged. And the Mishnah Berurah said, what's the purpose of this chutin? The Mishnah Berurah said, okay, the Mishnah Berurah has not yet explained the chutin. So let's go a little bit further over here. So here we see what it is that we have. We have the two opposite walls, we have the moat, we have the pole, we have the sheet, the talus, that is forming a canopy. It hangs down, the sheet or the beged hangs down on both sides and forms this canopy. Says the Mishnah Berurah, V'haya asur lases kain b'Shabbos. Would you be allowed to put up this sheet on Shabbos? Absolutely not. Demikri oyel arai, because you would be constructing an oyel arai, right? Let's remember, an oyel kva, an oyel roof that's sheltering over an area. If it's also lahagain, if you put up a roof, even if it's arai, even if it's only temporary, you create an oyel arai on Shabbos, that's an issa d'Rabbanan. An oyel kva, if you would put it up with intent for it to remain there for a significant amount of time, several days, so that would be an oyel kva that would be an issa d'Oraisa. But just to put up the horizontal sheet, even if there are no walls, if you're doing it lahagain, if you're doing it for the purposes of shelter, to create shade or to protect from the rain, that's an issa d'Rabbanan. Now, over here in this case, it happens to be that there's a mitigating factor. We're going to see, the Mishnah Berurah is going to say that in this case, there is no gag tefach. There's no horizontal surface at the peak that's at least a tefach wide. It's over a pole. It's narrow at the top. That's a mitigating factor. But we learned earlier in Sif Ches that even if there's no gag tefach, to put up an oyel arai on Shabbos is still an issa d'Rabbanan. It can't be an issa d'Oraisa. If you did this lehiskayim, if you did this for some permanence, so it's kva, it still wouldn't be an issa d'Oraisa because there's no gag tefach. But an issa d'Rabbanan it is. So again, to take this sheet and to drape this sheet over this pole on Shabbos in order to create a shelter underneath it, you could take a nap in the shade, that would definitely be an issa d'Rabbanan. Continues the Mishnah Berurah. So, also lasis ke b'Shabbos, this would be an issa d'Rabbanan on Shabbos, demikri oyel arai, because this would constitute creating an oyel arai on Shabbos, upotter avaloser, and this would be potter. You're not chayav karbachatos avaloser, but it would be an issa d'Rabbanan kibavur b'Sif Ches, like we learned earlier at Sif Ches. Uba loymar, and over here at Sif Yud, the Mechaber is coming to tell you, de'im kishahoisa hatalas mikupelas umunachas al hamoit may erev Shabbos. If, two variables here. If, first of all, this beged, this talus, this sheet, it was placed over the pole, not on Shabbos, it was placed there before Shabbos. Okay, that's mitigating factor number one. So, if the talus was folded over the pole, umunachas alamot, and it was placed over the pole, may erev Shabbos, and hayu bachutin tuluyin, it had threads or strings attached to the edge. For the purposes of our discussion here, where's my trusty ruler? Oh wow, I don't have one. Okay, we'll use a pen. If there were strings or threads attached either to this edge over here or to this edge over here or maybe to both edges. If there were strings, chutin of some kind, attached to those edges, sha'al yadon poshten liktzoiseha, and by using those threads, those are kind of like drawstrings. So right now, I have the sheet opened up, and we don't have a canopy. But there are threads or strings attached to the edge here, and you use them to draw the beged closed. Okay? That's what those strings are for. Those strings are there to help you draw the canopy closed. Put this aside for now. Whoops. It's a good thing, because it just broke. Landed on my keyboard, but it doesn't look like that did anything to the recording. Okay, so if hayu bachutin tluyin, if there were strings at the edges, shal yadon poishtel liksaiseha, that you use to draw the edges of the talus in order to close the canopy, now on Shabbos, you're allowed to go ahead and you're allowed to extend the sheet. So the sheet is holding over the pole. It was in the open position, but there are threads here at the side that you use to extend the sheet. You're allowed to extend the sheet over the entire canopied area. V'hatam. What's the reason for this? Why is this mutter? So again, let's do the math. Closing this canopy, extending this canopy, and creating a shelter underneath it where you could take a nap in the shade constitutes creating an oil arai that is asli lahagein. It's completely asli lahagein. You're taking a nap under it. Now let's remember, when you make an oil arai that's asli lahagein, it's aser, it's an issa b'derabanan, even if there are no mechitzas surrounding the area underneath. So an oil arai that's asli lahagein is very chamur. And even though there's a mitigating factor, because we're going to see in the Mishnah Berurah soon that there's no horizontal peak of a tefach at the top, so what? That only means, according to the Rif and the Rambam, who the Mechaber is following, that this can't possibly be elevated, escalated to the level of an Issa Daraisa. It can't be an oil kva, but an oil arai it is. So you're making an oil arai lahagein on Shabbos. Why is this mutter? Now, it's definitely usher on Shabbos to throw the sheet over the pole. That, the Mishnah Berurah said, is usher on Shabbos. But the Mechaber is telling us, if the sheet was already over the pole on Erev Shabbos, then, even though it was in the fully opened position, so there's no tefach closed, it's in the fully open position, if there are threads on the edges that you're going to use to draw the canopy shut, it's mutter to draw the canopy shut on Shabbos. And the question that we have to answer is why? Why isn't that closing an oil arai on Shabbos? And now says the Mishnah Berurah, I'll tell you why it's mutter. V'hatam. The reason for this is, since those strings that are on the edge make it very, very easy to pull this canopy closed, heavy ki'ilu haisa hatalis prusa mikvar tefach me'erev Shabbos ve'verak moisef al oil arai v'shari v'chanal b'sif beis. Mishnah Berurah is telling you like this. The Mishnah Berurah says, the presence of those strings on the edge that you use to draw the canopy closed, that the presence of those threads make it as if, remember, this is all in place from Erev Shabbos, because it has those threads that are going to serve as drawstrings or handles, if you will, to pull this closed, the presence of those strings makes us look at this as if it's already at least partially closed from Erev Shabbos. And let's remember the halacha by any oil arai. When you have an oil arai, if it's already extended a tefach from before Shabbos, then you're allowed to fully extend it because you're only being moisif on an oil arai. In this case, which is very kuladik, why is this case so kuladik? For many reasons. This case is kuladik because, first of all, there's no gag tefach. That's a mitigating factor right away. That means that this could never be an Issa Daraisa because there's no gag tefach. So that's a mitigating factor. Also, you're not putting the beged on Shabbos. The beged was already here over the pole from before Shabbos. Not only that, another mitigating factor. There are threads on the edge which make it very clear that this is here in order to be closed. Says the Mishnah Berurah, because of all of those mitigating factors, even when this canopy is in the fully opened position, we're going to consider it as if it's already closed a tefach, and now to close it the rest of the way is only being moisif on an oil arai. Now, it happens to be, I cannot say with 100% certainty that the Mishnah Berurah holds like the Aruch HaShulchan. But I could tell you that from the Aruch HaShulchan, the explanation of this halacha, and we're going to see how it flows directly into the halacha Sif Yod Aleph, according to the Aruch HaShulchan, pshat in this halacha is that the whole Issa D'Rabbanan, we have to go back to the underpinnings of the potential Isser here. The whole potential Isser over here is an Issa D'Rabbanan of creating an oil arai. Now we've seen that usually for an oil arai to be also D'Rabbanan, it has to look and feel to a certain extent as if you're constructing a shelter. So for example, when you make an oil arai that's not osir lahagen, right? The case of the bed, the case of the table. When you create an oil arai that's not intended to shelter the area underneath it, it's only osir d'Rabbanan if there are mechitzas around the bottom area, and only if you first put up the mechitzas and then put up the roof. Why? Because then it looks like and it feels like you're creating an oil. So it's merzi kiboine. There's something there that you see and you look at, and it looks and feels like something is constructing an oil on Shabbos. So that is an Issa D'Rabbanan. But if you put up the top and then you put up the mechitzas, then it doesn't feel like constructing an oil anymore, because that's not the way you construct an oil. The Aruch HaShulchan seems to say that that's the case over here as well. If you have this construct that we're talking about here, so let's say you didn't have the sheet placed over the pole before Shabbos. So then, if you come on Shabbos and you take the sheet and you drape it over the pole on Shabbos, okay, you're constructing a shelter. What are you doing? You're putting up a sheet in order to provide shade so that you can take a nap underneath it. Okay, that's an oil arai on Shabbos, also lahagen, it's also b'drabanan. But if the beged was already here before Shabbos, not only, okay, if it was here and it was already in the closed position, there would be no shaila. But if it's already here, even if it's opened all the way like this, but it has threads over here, so it's very clearly here from before Shabbos, so that you should be able to take the threads and draw it closed, then the act of drawing it closed, it does not look like the act of constructing an oil. No, there was already an oil here from before Shabbos. This is all clearly intended to be closed. Why is it here? Even if there isn't a tefach over here, even if the shelter is not closed a tefach, but since it's here from before Shabbos, and there are strings here to be used to draw it closed, we look at it as if the oil is already here, and the act of drawing it closed is only being moisif on an oil arai. It's not creating an oil arai, and therefore this is mutter. Okay, let's go near the end, few lines up off the end of Ois Katan Lamed Zayin, says the Chafetz Chaim. Because of a Magen Avram, and I already alluded to this, the Magen Avram writes, "The Mayri Sha'achar Prisasa Loyeh Begaga Bilabala Reichav Tefach." We need one other mitigating factor here that the Mechaber himself did not mention, and that is that at the peak of this canopy, there cannot be a horizontal plane of a tefach. You can't have a gag tefach. The gam loy b'pachas mishaloi samach legag reichav tefach. And also, if you're 3 tvachim off the top, you can't have a horizontal width between the two sides of the canopy, right? Like that. This can't be a tefach within 3 tvachim of the peak, because if we did, we would say limud, and this would create a closed horizontal plane of a tefach. Yesh barach of tefach, because if you did have a horizontal roof of a tefach at the top or near the top, so we're only willing to apply this kula that we're saying, that since the beged was here from before Shabbos, and it has the drawstrings, so we look at it that Come on, this is very clearly meant to be closed. It was erected before Shabbos. We're going to look at it as only being Mosif oil. We're only willing to say that if we have the mitigating factor that there's no Gag Tefach. But if there's a Gag Tefach, we're not going to apply this Kula. And the reason is very simple. The reason is because once you have a Gag Tefach, we could be playing with Daraisis, right? Because once you have a Gag Tefach, that's a bona fide oil. And now, depending on the case, if it was Kavua, if this would be something intended to be there for several days, already it would be oil Kva, it would be innocent Daraisa. But in our case, where it's a point, where it's a peak, and you don't have a Gag Tefach, you can't come to a Daraisa. So we're willing to be more Mekel. Moving along to Ice Cut Lamed Ches, says the Mishnah Berurah, the Mechaber said, Umuta Lefarka. Using these kulas, you're allowed to put up and close this canopy on Shabbos. You're also allowed to take it down on Shabbos. Explains the Mishnah Berurah, Shekal oil she'ein by mishum binyan. Anytime constructing an oil is mutter, and it's not considered an isser of bainam, ein by mishum stira. Taking it down would not constitute stira, and that would also be mutter. Now, the closing words of the Mechaber in Sif Yud was v'chein haparoiches. And I told you that this means a curtain. Now, the truth is, these two words pose a great difficulty because it sounds like the Mechaber is equating two halachas here. It sounds like he's saying you're allowed to draw close the canopy that we just described. You're also allowed to put up a curtain in front of a door. Now, those two halachas are not the same. The reason you're allowed to put up a curtain in front of a door, we learned at the very beginning of Siman Shin Tesvav. We learned that the construction of a mechitzas arai is never even asa b'drabanan. It's only the construction of an oil arai. An arai roof could be an issa d'rabanan, but a mechitzas arai is not an issa d'rabanan. And therefore, we learned right away in Sif Aleph in this Siman, we learned that you're allowed to put up a curtain. You want to put up a curtain in a door on Shabbos? No problem. It's a mechitzas arai, a mechitzas kva is also. Now let it go build a partition, a permanent partition on Shabbos, but to hang a curtain is a mechitzas arai. The only exception that we learned was if it's a mechitzah materis. If you're putting up a curtain in order to be matir or something, so it has significance in halacha, if you're putting up a curtain to construct the third wall of a sukkah, so it's being matir you eating in the sukkah on Yom Tov, then it has halachic significance, then the mechitzas arai becomes asur on Shabbos. But a regular curtain, a mechitzas arai, you want to put a curtain in your doorway on Shabbos, we said is mutter. And it's not mutter, the heter has nothing to do with the halacha that we just discussed about the canopy. So what does the Mechaber mean, v'chein haparoiches? So let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah, Ice Cut Lamed. Kolol bazeh gam viloin shelofnei Pesach. When the Mechaber says v'chein haparoiches, he's including in that a curtain that closes a doorway. In other words, this is not specifically talking about the pareiches in front of an Aron Kodesh. Any curtain. You want to put up a curtain between your living room and your dining room? Go ahead, put up a curtain. It's a mechitzas arai. V'ayin b'Magen Avram. The Mishnah Berurah tells us, take a look at the Magen Avram. Dahai v'chein lav davku. This word v'chein, which means and similarly, lav davku, is very imprecise. Deshari bazeh ava pisha loy hayu aleh chutin. The first halacha of Sif Yud, you needed to have those strings on the edge of the canopy to show that it's here and it's prepared in order to be drawn close. And therefore we look at it as if it's at least partially closed from before Shabbos. Says the Magen Avram, that has nothing to do with this halacha. You want to put up a curtain on Shabbos, you don't need drawstrings at the edge of the curtain to show that it's here to be closed. Bishum de'ein oyel ela asi kein gag. The whole halacha, the whole isser of making an oil arai is by a roof, not by a partition. So the Magen Avram basically takes out this word v'chein, and he says there's no similarity between the curtain and the first halach of Sif Yud. Okay, the Mishnah Berurah is obviously bothered by this, because the bottom line is, the Mechaber does say v'chein hapareiches. What are we going to do with it? So the Mishnah Berurah kind of stretches out, and he looks for some basis for this v'chein hapareiches. He finds a basis. The basis is tremendous chiddush, and the Mishnah Berurah is not really going to do anything with it. He's just finding a hook to hang the mechaber's hat on. Says the Mishnah Berurah, V'hinei. Lefi ma shehevi pal migdal oiz b'shem Rabbeinu Chananel. Seeing what the mechaber of the Sefer Migdal Oiz quotes from the Rabbeinu Chananel, v'cheinu beferish rach shelafanenu, and indeed, if we look in the rach in the Rabbeinu Chananel on Masechta Shabbos on Kuf Lamed Ches, we could see this in our Rabbeinu Chananel. Sheyotza mikarov la'or. Chafetz Chaim writes that in his time, the Rabbeinu Chananel on the side of the Gemara was relatively new. The Rabbeinu Chananel actually says that you want to put up a partition curtain in a doorway, let's say, on Shabbos. You're taka only allowed to do it if you have chutin, if you have strings that show that it's intended to be closed. So, says the Chafetz Chaim, according to that Rabbeinu Chananel, Yoiser Tov Loimar, it would be better to say, the Rambam, that the Rambam, Bal Halachazu, this V'chein B'paroichis is based on a Rambam. So says the Chafetz Chaim, seeing this Rabbeinu Chananel, who taka requires that a partition curtain would taka need chutin, so then we could say that the Rambam, that this halach is based on, Nami Sfir Le Karach, holds like that Rabbeinu Chananel. Vasi Shaper Milas V'chein Kipashte. Then we understand why the Mechaber said V'chein. Why did the Mechaber say V'chein? Because he's coming off the Rambam, and the Rambam holds like the Rabbeinu Chananel that if you want to put up a curtain on Shabbos, it needs to have drawstrings on the end that show that it's intended to be closed. The Gra seems to learn like this as well. However, halacha l'maisa, not negeh. Because from the Torah and other paiskim, it is very clear that you're allowed to hang a partition curtain under any circumstances. Like we learned earlier in Sif Aleph. Because since a regular partition curtain is not a mechitza hamateres, it's not being matir, eating in a sukkah, or being matir tashmish amita, all it is a partition curtain, ain't shom isser Allah. There's no isser in making a partition, a mechitza sarai. So basically, like I told you, the Mishnah Berurah is disturbed by the v'chein haparoiches. He brought down the Magen Avram, who says it's lav dafka. He's trying to find some basis for it better than saying lav dafka. So he's reaching out to Rabbeinu Chananel, and he's saying maybe the Rambam holds like the Rabbeinu Chananel. Problem is that we don't really have a pshat in the Rabbeinu Chananel. Why is it the Rabbeinu Chananel requires that when you're putting up a mechitza sarai, a curtain, you need to have chutin on the end that show that it's meant to be drawn close? So that's a whole different chabura. What pshat in the Rabbeinu Chananel is, we don't need pshat in the Rabbeinu Chananel for what we're doing. Kasav Magen Avram, the Magen Avram further writes, the mechitza ha'aseh lahatir, if you're putting up a mechitza hamateres on Shabbos, shapasach ha'shulchan aruch le'el b'sef aleph to aseh la'aseisa b'Shabbos. Remember, a mechitza hamateres we said is aser. Hu afilu kishay chutin kruchin aleh me'erev Shabbos. That halacha, that it's aser to put up a mechitza hamateres, don't think that if you put strings on the end to use it to draw it closed from before Shabbos, don't think that if it has strings on it, you're allowed to put it up on Shabbos. No, you're still not. A mechitza hamateres, you're not allowed to put up on Shabbos. However, the yesh shemakilin bazeh. There are those that are mekel in this halacha. Okay. Let's try. Hopefully my voice will hold out. Let's try to get through Sif Yud Aleph. So again, it'll be much easier to go through Sif Yud Aleph if we understand the basis for the halacha of Sif Yud. So in Sif Yud, we're saying that canopy, as long as the beged that's forming the canopy was thrown over the pole before Shabbos, and it has chutin, it has strings at the end that you're going to use to draw it closed, then even if Shabbos afternoon you come to this construct and the canopy is fully open meaning that it's not extended, right? It's not extended even a tefach. Now you want to take a nap Shabbos afternoon, you're allowed to take hold of those strings, and you're allowed to extend the canopy, and you're allowed to close it, and this is not going to present an isser of creating an oil arai on Shabbos. And why is that? So I'm explaining it like what I saw in the Aruch HaShulchan. The presence of the chutin, the presence of those drawstrings at the edge of the canopy, show that this is a canopy that is intended to be drawn closed. Since it was in place before Shabbos, and it's very clearly intended to be drawn closed and drawn open and everything else, when you go to draw it closed on Shabbos afternoon to take a nap, we don't look at this as you are creating an oil on Shabbos. No, we look at it that it's an oil that's already in place. Similarly to if it would be extended already at tefach. And now what you're doing on Shabbos is, all you're doing is being moisif on a pre-existing oil aray. So that's Sif Yud. Now we come to Sif Yud Aleph, which is very, very similar. Says the Mechaber. Kilas, and the Aruch HaShulchan Taka writes that this is the same halacha. There's just an iota of a difference. Says the Mechaber. Kilas chasanim, a bridal canopy. She'ein begaga tefach, that does not have a horizontal roof of a tefach. V'loi b'pakus b'shloisha samach legaga rochav a tefach. Nor does the canopy come to a horizontal gap of a tefach within 3 tefachim of the peak. Hayil shehi mesukenes lakach, these are the key words. Hayil shehi mesukenes lakach, since this is very clearly prepared from before Shabbos in order to be closed, mutter l'ntaisa, you're allowed to stretch it out, umutter l'farka, and you're allowed to open it. Okay, we'll stop here for a second. First of all, what is a kilas chasanim? What is this bridal canopy? So a bridal canopy is very, very easy to understand. Once again, let's use some visual aids. For the bridal canopy, you've got a bed. What happened to my pole? There it is. You've got a bed. The bed's got a headboard, and the bed's got a footboard. Okay? Now, well, actually, let's do it a little bit different. You've got, well, no, you know what? I like it better the first way. Okay, whatever. We don't really need this so much. I think you'll be able to understand it. The bed's got a headboard. The bed's got a footboard. Now, okay? Headboard, footboard. In the middle of the headboard, there's a beam, a vertical beam that goes up. In the middle of the footboard, there's a vertical beam that goes up. So the headboard and the footboard each have a vertical beam at their center. At the top of those two beams, there is a beam that goes from end to end over the bed. So basically, you've got a horizontal beam that is extending over the center of the bed. Now, to create the bridal canopy, you're taking a sheet and you're hanging it over the pole. And the pole is going to form a triangular canopy over the bed. Very simple. So you've got your beam coming up from your headboard, you've got your beam coming up from your footboard, you've got your horizontal beam that goes over the center of the bed, you've got the canopy that's creating a triangular teepee, a triangular canopy over the bed. That's the kilas chasanim. What's the halacha Mechaber says? Oh, kilas chasanim? Let's say the canopy was pulled open. So the canopy was already in place from before Shabbos, but it wasn't extended. It was open. On Shabbos, you're allowed to go and you're allowed to extend it closed. Now this sounds oddly like the halacha of Sif Yud. Sif Yud, we were talking about a pole that went between two opposing walls, and you had a canopy, and somebody wants to extend the canopy and close it so he can take a nap underneath it on Shabbos. What did we say in Sif Yud? You're only allowed to do that if there are chutin, if there are drawstrings on the edge here that are made to open it and shut it. But what did we say? What was the purpose of those drawstrings? The purpose of the presence, the mitigating factor of those drawstrings is that those drawstrings illustrate to us the purpose of this beged. The drawstrings make it very clear to us that this beged that's thrown over this pole is there to be open and shut. Since the drawstrings show us that this is prepared in order to be open and shut, that's matter us to open and shut it on Shabbos, because we look at it as if it's a pre-existing canopy that's there from before Shabbos. That was Sif Yud. The only difference between Sif Yud and Sif Yud Aleph is now the pole is not between two opposing walls. Now the pole is between the footboard and the headboard of a bed. That's the difference. But that difference makes a very big difference. You know why? Because in this case, you don't need chutin. By the bed, you don't need chutin on the edge of the canopy to illustrate for us that this is made to be open and closed. It's the canopy over a bed. The canopy over a bed, everybody knows, is made to be open and closed. That's what the Mechaber says. The Mechaber says Sif Yud Aleph is more kuladik than Sif Yud. Why? Because this is very clearly constructed to be open and closed on Shabbos. We don't need chutin. So it's mutter to extend the canopy, and it's mutter to open the canopy without chutin. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Eis Katan Mem, Kills Chasanim, Eitz Echad Oimid L'Rosh Hamita. There's one vertical beam at the center of the head of the bed, Gavaya Me'amita, going up from the bed. V'chein Oimid Eitz B'Margalois Hamita. There's another vertical beam at the center of the footboard of the bed, U'Moit Nasan Aleim, and there's a pole going from one end to the other over the center of the bed, U'Paras Alamoit Vilain Gadol, and there's a big curtain draped over the pole, U'Shtei Rashid Yarded Mikan and Mikan, and the two sides extend down over both sides of the bed. Kibin Oyel Al Panei Kalamita. You're allowed to open and close this on Shabbos. Since it's clearly prepared to be opened and closed. Pirish. It's very clear that this was prepared to be closed and opened on Shabbos. And when did you prepare it? Before Shabbos. So again, this is not constructing an oil on Shabbos. If you close it on Shabbos, you're extending a pre-constructed oil on Shabbos. This is called b'moisif on an oil arai on Shabbos, which is mutter. And in this case, you don't need chutin. Why don't you need chutin? Because it's a canopy over a bed. And a canopy over a bed is clearly intended to be opened and closed to give shelter over the bed. Aval im eino mesukenes, asur. But this would be asur if it wasn't prepared like this before Shabbos. In other words, would you be allowed to throw a curtain over this pole on Shabbos? No, that would be asur. Because even though this is peaked and you don't have a horizontal tefach at the peak, also this is drabanan to do this at Shabbos. Unless you either have chutin or it's over a bed. I'm going to stop over here simply because I'm not going to be able to make it through the next halacha. We'll continue next time at the end of Sif Yud Aleph, V'hu Shaloi Tehei Mishul Shelas. Thank you so much for joining me for Limud HaTorah. Listen to Limud HaTorah should be hanging against Klal Yisrael. The Rosh Hashanah should send Yeshua the first Parnasset Shidduchim to those in need. We should be zeicher to see the B'yas Gal Tzedek B'Be'er V'Yameinu Amen. Be well.